Let's set aside the usual story you hear about climate change. You know, the one focused purely on the humanitarian crisis. Today, we're looking at this through a completely different lens: strategy. We're opening up the climate chessboard, and we're going to show you how human migration is becoming the single most powerful piece in a global game of power.
And that brings up a really critical question, one that frames this entire analysis. What if these environmental disasters aren't just random crises? What if they're actually creating strategic opportunities? Could the movement of millions of people be quietly redrawing the alliances and conflicts that define entire continents?
And this leads us to the core thesis of what we're talking about today. You know, traditional armies and military hardware, they still matter, of course. But the most powerful force reshaping the geopolitical map right now, it's the mass movement of human beings. That is the new strategic reality. Now, to really understand this, we have to change how we're looking at it. Climate migration isn't just a consequence of a problem. It's a catalyst. It actually acts as what's called a force multiplier, which means it takes existing tensions and just amps them up, creating new leverage that can destabilize borders and totally rewrite alliances. So, what do we actually mean by a force multiplier here? Well, think of it this way. Environmental displacement takes pressures that are already there, like economic stress or political friction, and just intensifies them. So, for example, a country with a fragile economy is suddenly hit with a massive influx of people they have to provide for. Or a border that was already tense can erupt into a full-blown crisis when refugees start arriving. It's right there, in those moments, that strategic advantages and liabilities are really created. Okay, so let's look at the actual chessboard. We're going to zoom in on Asia because this is where these dynamics are playing out, with incredibly high stakes right now. We're going to look at the specific hotspots where this new strategic game is being fought. And what you see is that the crisis looks different depending on where you are. In South Asia, you've got this perfect storm of intense flooding and just immense population density. That's creating a huge pressure point right on the India-Bangladesh border. Then you go to Southeast Asia, where entire megacities are sinking. That's pushing people along these established migration routes, straining several countries all at once. And in Central Asia, it's all about water scarcity, which has basically turned control over upstream rivers into a massive geopolitical weapon. Each one of these drivers creates a really unique and volatile situation. But here's the crucial part. This pressure, this chaos, it doesn't stay chaotic forever. Smart geopolitical players, they learn to manage it, to direct it, and then ultimately to leverage it. So let's look at how a raw environmental problem gets turned into a powerful political tool. This timeline shows you how it happens. It's a clear progression. It starts internally, right? Around 2015, countries are mostly focused on their own domestic climate issues. But then, as people start moving across borders, that creates friction. And by 2026, we see that friction being turned into actual political leverage. At that point, the conversation isn't about humanitarian aid anymore. It's about transactions, with things like aid and infrastructure projects becoming bargaining chips in exchange for managing these flows of people. So when you have this new kind of leverage, it inevitably shakes up the regional hierarchy. It creates a whole new power index with very clear winners and losers. And this index, it's not based on who has the biggest army. It's based on who has strategic exposure and who controls the things that make people move. Let's take a look at a prime example. This chart shows a country that controls the source of a major river. This gives them incredibly high access to water, which is a critical resource. And with that control, they can build dams, they can divert the flow, they can effectively turn the tap on and off for every single nation downstream. And that control over water, well, it has a direct and massive consequence. It translates almost perfectly into regional influence. Those downstream nations facing water shortages and the very real possibility that their own populations will have to move, they just lose bargaining power. Their strategic depth shrinks because their survival now depends on decisions made by their upstream neighbors. So to kind of sum up this new dynamic, we're really seeing two types of nations emerging. On one side, you have countries that are losing strategic depth. They're vulnerable to things like sea level rise, and they're struggling with migration they can't manage. And on the other side, you have nations that are gaining influence because they control the critical resources that drive that migration, and they use things like aid and infrastructure as diplomatic tools to lock in their power. So, where does all this leave us? What does it mean for the future? Well, it means we have to fundamentally change how we think about territory and power. We're looking at a brand new strategic map, one that isn't defined by static lines, but by the constant dynamic flow of human beings. And this, right here,
This is the single most important takeaway. The real borders of the 21st century, they're not the lines you see on a map. They're the paths being carved across the world by millions of people on the move. And those are the lines that will decide the future of conflict, wealth, and power.
Which brings us right back to where we started, but now it's backed up by evidence. The movement of people isn't just a force of nature anymore. It's a political force, and it's redefining power faster than any traditional military strategy could ever hope to keep up with.
And so, this leaves us with the one defining question for the decades to come. In a world where human migration is the ultimate source of both leverage and instability, the most powerful player on the global chessboard will be the one who can answer a single, simple question: who controls the flow?